Let me introduce first Carolina Waaseggers, who has a PhD in Assyriology from the University of Ghent in Belgium, and she is now the professor of Assyriology at the Leiden University Institute for Area Studies. She's a historian of the first millennium BCE, Babylonia, and she is especially interested in the establishment of the Persian Empire there and the reactions that this process triggered among different social groups. She currently had a grant from the ERC, European Research Council, Persia and Babylonia, creating a new context for understanding the emergence of the First World Empire. And she's broadly published several books and edited several other books. Carolina, are you there? Okay, please go ahead.
I'm here. Good morning, everybody. I would much have preferred to be with you today. I especially extend my apologies to my session partner, Celine. I would have enjoyed to be together with you behind the table and be questioned by our colleagues. And I also would like to extend my gratitude to the organizers for understanding the situation and for allowing me to present my paper online. So when I started writing this paper, I was puzzled by the fact that we are unable, or perhaps even unwilling, to assign Babylonian literature to the Achaemenid period. This is puzzling because Babylonia was a highly literate part of the empire. Its libraries and archives were thriving. It had a small but influential circle of literati who, at least in previous decades, had produced many original works of scholarship and literature. And even in wider society, it is believed that a good share of people mastered the skills of reading and writing, even if only for practical purposes. Now, this literate culture persisted under the Persians. Many thousands of cuneiform texts testify to the enduring importance of the written word in many facets of life. However, when it comes to the literary history of Babylonia in the Persian period, we seldomly proceed beyond the Cyrus Cylinder and the verse account, sometimes adding the Nabonidus Chronicle and Babylonian versions of the Bisitun and other Persian royal inscriptions. Certainly, these works are remarkable, iconic even, but this is rather a thin catch, given that we are dealing with 200 years in the history of a highly literate ancient society. So what is going on here? Why is our catalogue of Persian-period Babylonian literature so thinly populated? I will spend the first part of my presentation discussing this Persian problem, and then I will offer 3 ways forward, each illustrated with some brief examples summarized from my paper. Persian-period Babylonian literature is not a category we currently work with. So far, no history of cuneiform literature has been written that considers this 200-year period worthwhile to examine as a distinct phase. In contrast to the preceding Neo-Babylonian period, the heyday of Babylonian culture, and also in contrast to the ensuing Hellenistic period, which is often perceived as a kind of Babylonian Renaissance. The following quote from the book by Ben Foster expresses some of the underlying ideas that explain our lack of engagement with the Persian period. The Persian conquest of Babylonia had no significant effect on Akkadian literature. The continuities of Babylonian culture, from the Neo-Babylonian period to the reigns of the Persian monarchs, far outweighed the very limited impact of Persian culture, or even of the internationalization of Babylonia. very few Akkadian literary compositions can be dated specifically to the period of Persian rule. Now let us unpack these ideas behind this quote. First, we need to realize that until recently, the Persian period was a neglected area in Assyriology. In 1996, Pierre Briand, in his magnum opus, lamented that Persian history was a field deserted by Assyriologists. And he was right, although at that very moment things were changing. Thanks to the work of cuneiformists like Matthew Stolper and Govert van Driel, and ancient historians like Amélie Court, Hélène Sansizi, and of course Pierre Briand himself. Through their work, we became aware of the huge potential residing in the cuneiform text corpus for writing the history of the Persian Empire from below, from one of its key satrapies. Now, decades later, the Persian period is fully integrated in Assyriology, but most work is done on archival texts, which means that social and economic histories lead the way, and Babylonia's literary and cultural history is still underappreciated. Second, there is a familiar ring to Foster's evaluation of the Persian conquest as having no effect on Akkadian literature. This ties into the old idea that the Persian Empire was essentially a weak state, only loosely anchored in its territories. This idea has been debunked with vigor since the 1990s, and nowadays it is rather the empire's resilience and efficiency that is emphasized. Its unique achievement of forging a step change in the history of ancient globalization. Third, Assyriology has had its own ways of obscuring creativity in the late period. Oppenheim's concept of the stream of tradition portrayed Babylonian literary production in the first millennium as a static affair, with scribes merely replicated a received canon. This notion is challenged in fundamental ways recently, among others by Céline's work on late Babylonian priestly literature. We now realize that many compositions attested in late libraries are known from only one manuscript, whereas such single manuscript texts used to be dismissed as accidental omissions from the canon. Their testimony as original works in their specific historical contexts is now taken much more seriously. So altogether, these new developments foster an environment that is more open than ever to evaluate Babylonian literary production within the context of the Persian Empire. So the time is right to reconsider this topic. However, there are some structural features of the text corpus that challenge us. First, there is the perennial difficulty of dating cuneiform literary texts. I'm not going to get into that here. I reflect a little bit in the paper, but a more pressing problem is the archival infrastructure that underpins the cuneiform text corpus of the Persian period. Here I try to visualize on this slide the archival deficiencies that apply to each of the three conventional sub-periods of the Persian era. The mature 5th century is poorly documented because of the interruption of archival practices that happened early in the reign of Xerxes. The first 50 years are very well documented, but they are part of the so-called long 6th century, a period of more than 100 years starting in the early Neo-Babylonian Empire, in which archives and libraries display a high degree of continuity. Unless a colophon supplies an explicit date or perhaps the name of a scribe, it is often impossible to date manuscripts specifically to the Persian decades of this long 6th century. A similar condition prevails at the tail end of the Persian rule over Babylonia. There, the Esangil library is the richest, though not the only source of literary texts. This library was in active use during 3 political periods: Late Achaemenid, Hellenistic, and Parthian. Here too, it is difficult to attribute texts to a specific epoch. Recently, there is a tendency to date many literary texts from Esangil to the Hellenistic period as part of a cultural revival pushed by the assertive agenda of Babylon's priesthood under Seleucid rule. However, as Céline also points out in her paper, such attributions are often tentative and an earlier date can mostly not be ruled out. In short, there is a centrifugal quality to the text corpus itself and to our evaluation of it. The Central Persian period is poorly documented as it is, whereas texts that could have been produced in the early and late decades of Persian rule are more likely placed in the Neo-Babylonian time bracket or in the Hellenistic period. And this leaves the whole intervening stretch of the Persian Empire underappreciated. Now, what can we take away from these reflections on the Persian problem? Well, first, it is more than likely that there is scope to expand the catalogue of Persian-period Babylonian literature if we are willing to look at our materials with an open mind and reconsider some of the traditional datings that have been proposed. Second, it seems entirely unlikely that Persia's global empire did not affect cultural production in one way or the other. On the contrary, we should rather expect that this impact was profound. Third, as our work on archives and libraries progresses, we understand better and better what's there, but also what's not there. What happens if we really listen to the silences in the text corpus? Are there any literary genres that ceased to be productive? And what do such silences signify? In my paper, I offer 9 case studies to illustrate these 3 areas. Here I will focus on just a few items. To add to the first point, expanding our catalogue, we can begin with a text from the pre-conquest period that responds to the military advance of Cyrus before his attack on Babylonia. The Account Cylinder of Nabonidus describes how Cyrus raised a rebellion against his overlord, King Astyages of Media, in the 3rd year when Nabonidus was king. The text paints a rather diminutive portrait of Cyrus as a young servant leading a small army whose actions are desired by Marduk and in line with Nabonidus' own goals. However, what's often overlooked is that the cylinder was written many years after the events it describes, in the 16th year of Nabonidus. At that point, Cyrus had already conquered Media, Lydia, and likely eastern Iran. The diminutive portrait of Cyrus does not tally with current reality at all. It makes him smaller, less threatening than he actually was at the time. In fact, only a few months later, Cyrus did conquer Babylonia and bring Nabonidus' empire to its knees. What's particularly striking is that this inscription was mass-produced. More than 50 copies were made, which is far more than any other royal text we know. This suggests that Nabonidus or his advisors tried to spread a calming message to the people. The fact that dozens of copies were found in one place, including this one that is now in the Metropolitan Museum, suggests that reality caught up with this propaganda effort and that Babylonia's population may never have heard Nabonidus' reassuring words. Moving on to the Persian period proper, among the texts that are usually attributed to the Neo-Babylonian period, there are several candidates for inclusion in our expanded catalogue of Persian-period literature. Here I will focus on perhaps my most controversial proposition, so I'm just grabbing this opportunity to test and run this idea by you. One of the most famous forgeries from ancient Mesopotamia is the cruciform monument of Manishtushu. It was discovered in the Ibabar temple of Sippar by Hormuz Trasam in the late 19th century in a secluded room next to the main cella of the sun god Shamash. It is a cunning masterpiece that fooled modern editors at first, in making them believe that this was an actual inscription of the 23rd century BCE Akkadian king. In reality, it is a recarved Uduru stone from the 6th century, as Saul Berger and others have shown. It imitates the style, language, and script of original Akkadian inscriptions to fake a charter of donation by this ancient king to the Ibabar more than 1,500 years earlier. The forgery is usually dated to the reign of Nabonidus, who carried out extensive building work on this temple. Priests would have faked the ancient charter to inspire their own king to similar deeds. However, this date is open for revision. Irving Finkel and Alexandra Fletcher recently studied the old maps, letters, and other descriptions that Rassam provided of his discovery in room 170 of the Ibabar complex. And they come to the conclusion that the monument was part of a larger installation consisting of two parts, one above ground and one below. The Manishtushu monument was placed in a brick casing above ground, together with two identical cylinders of Nabonidus that commemorate his building work at Ibabar. The second part of the installation was found immediately below, in a hole pierced through the floor. This underground level contained the famous clay coffer with the sun god tablet and some related objects. The sun god tablet is about the miraculous reinstallation of the cult of Shamash by King Nabu Abla-Idina in the 9th century, after the cult statue of Shamash had gone missing in the preceding centuries. Now, Finkel and Fletcher argue that the two parts of this assemblage, above and below ground, were conceived and created as a unity. But when was this done? Based on the Nabonidus cylinders, the assemblage is usually dated to that king's second year when he finished his work at Ibabar. However, the findings of Finkel and Fletcher make this unlikely because they insist that the underground part was made only after the floor had already been laid. A hole was pierced in the dry floor to reach basement level, and repairs were needed to cover everything up afterwards. This shows that the installation was not part of Nabonidus' original plans for Ibabar, but that it postdated his restoration. How much it postdates it is, of course, open for speculation. There is still a window of 15 years in the reign of Nabonidus himself in which this could have happened. But it also invites us to consider a date in the Persian period. Now, does a Persian date for this assemblage make sense? I think there is support for this suggestion in the text of the monument itself. We hear Manishtushu utter the following words: I smote and conquered Anshan and Sherichum. The king of Anshan and Sherichum, with his gifts and presents, I brought into the presence of Shamash, my master. This passage was not entirely made up by the forgers, far from it. It is based on the so-called standard inscription of Manishtushu, of which several original copies were kept on the temple's premises in the so-called Ebabar Museum. However, the forgers did elaborate and adapt the original inscription by adding that the conquered king was brought into the presence of Shamash. This local scene is missing from the original inscriptions. The imaginary submission of the king of Anshan to Shamash is a fantasy that may have appealed especially in the early years of the Persian Empire, because at that time, Anshan was the geographical and dynastic origin that Cyrus advertised for himself in Babylonia. It is used, for instance, in the Cyrus Cylinder. We can take this argument one step further. A tablet copy of the monument text was made in Sipar, which elaborates precisely this passage, and in a rather painful fashion for the king of Anshan. It reads, I subdued Anshan and the city of Melucha. The king of Anshan and Melucha in a silver neckstock I brought into the presence of Shamash. In addition to the neckstock, the text introduces Melucha, which is interesting because it could represent an update after the Persian Empire had extended its territory towards India under Darius the Great. But I'm also aware that Melucha has a different connotation in first millennium Babylonian sources. Ultimately, it remains impossible to confirm a Persian date for the cruciform monument. But the combined evidence of the pierced floor, the resonance of Anshan to a Persian-period audience, and the contemporary engagement with specifically that part of the text make this a distinct possibility. Another reason why a Persian date is likely has to do with the subject matter of the texts that were stored with the monument in room 170. All these objects commemorate acts of royal endowment and protection of Ibabar, acts that are partly imagined and partly historical, and together they cover the entire historical arch from the earliest kings of Akkad to the last native king, Nabonidus. Now, why would the deep history of royal endowment have mattered to the priestly community of Ebabar? For this, we need to move on to the topic of silence that I already briefly announced. One of the most drastic changes in the literary landscape of Babylonia under Persian rule is the end of the local tradition of royal inscriptions. The Neo-Babylonian kings had been fervent practitioners of the epigraphic habit, inscribing their names, deeds, and pious sentiments across cities, mountain ridges, and natural rocks. This practice was especially intensive in the metropolitan core of their empire, where in cities great and small, buildings, streets, and walls were inscribed in relentless fashion. The finer details of these messages were doubtlessly unintelligible to the illiterate majority, but as material language, they spoke universally on behalf of the king, because he alone practiced this kind of epigraphic activity. Every clay cylinder, every stabbed brick, every pavement slab transmitted a message that was emphatically and unmistakably royal in origin. This practice thus gave material expression to the role of the king as a caretaker of his community and of his gods. Cyrus initially embraced this tradition, as shown by the Cyrus Cylinder and some other inscriptions in his name, but soon this practice was suspended entirely. Now we have to imagine that in the cities where the very fabric of streets and buildings had spoken so loudly of the king's generosity, the sudden end of the epigraphic habit must have been experienced deeply and widely by literate and illiterate people alike. This silence, I would argue, was a form of political mass communication, with its meaning probably clear to most. The traditional contract between the king, his community, and the gods had changed under the new rulers. It is against this backdrop that we need to understand why priests at the Ebabar temple went to such lengths to forge a document proving that their rights had always existed and had always been honored. Before closing off, I need to talk in anticipation of Celine's paper about Elam. You might have noticed that Celine's and my papers partly overlap when we discuss historical narratives about the conflict between Elam and Babylonia in the 12th century. John Nielsen showed that this historical event inspired a lively and pliable literary tradition that evolved over centuries as new works were composed in dialogue with the earlier ones, adding up multiple layers of meaning over time. Celine focuses on the very last stage of this tradition and convincingly shows that the late Esangil community gave a unique new direction to this literature, among others by casting priests in roles that were traditionally reserved for the king. In my paper, I deal with a slightly earlier Persian phase of these Elam narratives, which significantly, I think, do not yet push this clerical agenda that Celine describes. Those earlier texts are firmly embedded in a worldview that could not contemplate alternatives beyond kingship to secure the political order. The main concern of these earlier Elam texts is with the question of what constitutes a legitimate king of Babylon. They discuss this question in narratives that are set in the past, but the problems that they address are specific to the composite monarchy that the Persians had introduced. This type of monarchy involved combining several crowns together in the person of one king, it was a new model and apparently not one accepted eagerly by the Babylonian authors of our texts. They formulated two principles that basically ruled out the possibility that a Persian-born king could ever rule legitimately in Babylonia. The first principle that they developed is the idea that a king of Babylon should also be a native of that city, reflected in newly coined epithets like the seat of Babylon or the creation of Shuana. The second principle that we find in these texts is that the seed of Babylon could not be transmitted in the female line. This implies that dynastic marriages will never enable foreign rulers non-native to the city of Babylon to engender legitimate heirs. These two principles combined render the entire idea of a composite monarchy in the eyes of these Babylonians unacceptable. The texts that Céline studies show that later on the discussion about kingship was taken in a new direction in the community of Esagil. Now, wrapping up, I hope to have shown that there is space to expand the catalogue of Persian-period Babylonian literature, and that this is a meaningful label to use. This literature can be seen to respond in different ways to the global empire of the Achaemenids, for instance, in discussing new models of kingship and also exploring new synchronisms of history, which is a topic I elaborate in the paper but have left out for now. We have also seen that we have sufficient grip now on the text corpus to pick up meaningful absences, and that it can be instructive to also consider silence within the framework of the Achaemenid Empire. Thank you very much.